What is the true price of an empire? Is it paid in the blood of its enemies, or in the slow creeping terror that poisons the soul of its ruler? In the year 1519, the Aztec Empire was a universe unto itself, a shimmering, brutal jewel floating on the waters of Lake Texcoco. Its heart was the city of Tenochtitlan, a metropolis of several 100,000 souls, a Venice of the New World built on canals and chinampas, the floating gardens that fed a civilization. Yet a shadow was falling upon this golden age, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. For 8 years, the heavens themselves seemed to conspire against the Tlatoani, the great speaker, Moctezuma II. An ear of corn made of fire had blazed across the sky, a comet so bright it turned night into a ghostly twilight. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun, the very patron of the empire, had burst into flames for no reason, its wooden beams consumed by a fire that water could not quench. What god turns against his own house? The omens were relentless, each more bizarre than the last. A bolt of lightning from a clear sky struck another temple. The lake itself boiled, its waters rising in a great, unnatural swell to flood the city's foundations. And then came the voices. A woman was heard weeping in the night, a spectral lament for her lost children, for a future that was about to be erased. This was La Llorona, the weeping woman, her cries echoing through the silent causeways, a prophecy of cosmic grief. Moctezuma, a ruler who was more priest than warrior, a man paralyzed by his deep faith in a fatalistic cosmos, saw these signs not as warnings but as confirmations of an ancient, terrifying prophecy. The codices, the painted books that held the memory of his people, spoke of a long-departed god, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. He was a god of creation, a bringer of knowledge and art, who, unlike the other bloodthirsty deities in the Aztec pantheon, despised human sacrifice. Legend claimed he was fair-skinned and bearded, and that he had sailed east across the Great Sea, promising to one day return in a year of one reed to reclaim his kingdom. By a cruel twist of cosmic alignment, the year 1519 was precisely the year one reed in the Aztec calendar. The omens were not just random disasters, they were the heralds of a returning god. A god whose arrival would mean the end of the current world, the end of the fifth sun, the age of the Aztec people. Moctezuma consulted his soothsayers, his priests, his magicians. Their answers were vague, filled with trembling and fear. Enraged by their impotence, he had them imprisoned, their families executed. But killing the messenger could not kill the message. The universe was speaking, and its language was fear. The empire, for all its might, was built on a fragile foundation of cosmic terror and the subjugation of its neighbors. Its grandeur was a mask for its deepest insecurity. The Aztec world was one of perpetual debt, a debt paid in blood. Their gods were insatiable, demanding a constant flow of human hearts to keep the sun in the sky and the world from collapsing into eternal darkness. This was not random cruelty, it was a sacred duty, a cosmic necessity. The empire's main purpose was to wage war, not for territory in the European sense, but for captives. The so-called flower wars were ritualized conflicts arranged with enemy states, like the neighboring Tlaxcalans, with the sole objective of capturing warriors for the sacrificial stone. A captured warrior was not a prisoner of war, he was divine food. To die on the altar of the great temple in Tenochtitlan, your heart ripped from your chest by an obsidian knife and held up to the sun, was considered a glorious death, ensuring a noble afterlife as a hummingbird following the sun on its daily journey. This worldview, so alien to a European mind, was the engine of the empire. It justified the brutal subjugation of dozens of city-states, from whom the Aztecs demanded not just goods and food, but a steady tribute of human lives. The Aztecs were not loved, they were feared, and the resentment among their vassals was a vast, simmering ocean of hatred waiting for a catalyst to boil over. The gods demanded blood, and the empire provided it, but a system built on such fear is a pyramid balanced on its point. Imagine standing atop the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Maya. Below you, the city spreads out, a marvel of engineering and order. Whitewashed palaces and temples gleam in the sun, connected by canals filled with thousands of canoes. The great marketplace of Tlatelolco hums with the commerce of an empire, trading in everything from jaguar pelts and brilliant macaw feathers to cocoa beans and gold dust. The air is clean, the streets swept daily by 1,000 workers. It is a city more populous and arguably more hygienic than any in Europe at the time. But from this height, you can also see the Tzompantli, the skull rack, a horrifying monument displaying thousands of human skulls, a stark reminder of the price of this order. The splendor and the savagery were two sides of the same coin. The Aztecs were poets and artists of incredible skill, astronomers who charted the heavens with stunning accuracy, and architects who built a city on an impossible geography. They were also masters of a state-sponsored terror that kept their world turning. What is more terrifying, a god who demands your heart on an altar, or a man who comes for your gold with a cross in his hand? The question would soon cease to be theoretical. Moctezuma, trapped in his palace, surrounded by signs of impending doom, did not know the answer. He only knew that something was coming from the east, from across the water, and his world was about to break. The reports that reached the emperor were fantastical, bordering on the insane. Messengers, their faces pale with terror, spoke of floating mountains or towers moving on the water off the coast of the Yucatan. These were not canoes, not anything ever seen before. They had vast white wings like colossal birds that caught the wind. From their sides they could bellow thunder and spit fire, and from these floating mountains came men. Men with skin as pale as limestone, with hair on their faces the color of the sun, and bodies encased in a strange, gleaming shell that arrows could not pierce. They rode upon enormous hornless deer, beasts so powerful and fast they seemed to be one with their riders. To the Aztecs, who had never seen a horse, these centaur-like beings were monsters, supernatural apparitions. Were these the emissaries of Quetzalcoatl? Were they the god himself, returned in his promised form? Moctezuma had to know. He dispatched emissaries bearing the finest gifts the empire could offer, intricate featherwork, mosaics of turquoise, and, most importantly, massive discs of gold and silver, one representing the sun, the other the moon. They were gifts fit for a god. They were also a fatal mistake. The emissaries carried with them the regalia of Quetzalcoatl, a mask of turquoise snakes, a feathered cloak, and were instructed to dress the leader of these strange men in the vestments of the returning deity. The gesture was meant as an act of supreme reverence, an acknowledgement of divine power. But to the strangers it was merely confirmation that they had found what they were looking for. The leader of these strange men was no god. He was Hernán Cortés, a man of 34 years, born of minor nobility in the arid lands of Extremadura, Spain. He was a man of immense ambition, charm, and utter ruthlessness. He had studied law but abandoned it for the lure of the New World, a place where a man with quick wits and a sharp sword could carve out a kingdom for himself. He was a product of the Reconquista, the centuries-long war to drive the Moors from Spain, a conflict that had forged a generation of men who were fanatically devout, brutally pragmatic, and accustomed to violence. They believed they served God and their king, but their most immediate and pressing deity was gold. When Cortés and his men saw the gifts from Moctezuma, their eyes widened. The intricate artistry was lost on them. They saw only the raw material. The great wheel of gold, as large as a cartwheel, was not a symbol of the sun god. It was a fortune, a confirmation of the legends of a golden city that had driven them across the ocean. From that moment, the fate of the Aztec Empire was sealed. The Aztecs built their empire on blood, but the conquistadors came to drown it in gold. Cortés now had a singular, unshakable goal. He would find the source of this fabulous wealth, and he would take it. Nothing and no one would stand in his way. He understood with a predator's instinct that Moctezuma's gifts were not a show of strength, but a gesture of fear. And fear was a weapon he knew how to wield. His expedition was technically illegal, launched in defiance of the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, who saw Cortés as an insubordinate upstart. Cortés had assembled a paltry force, just over 500 soldiers, 16 horses, 32 crossbows, 13 muskets, and a few small cannons. It was a laughable army to challenge an empire of millions. But Cortés possessed weapons far more powerful than steel or gunpowder. He had unshakable self-belief, a genius for manipulation, and a profound understanding of human weakness. To ensure his men had no thoughts of retreat, no option but to push forward into the unknown heart of this vast new land, he made a decision of legendary audacity. He declared that the ships that had brought them from Cuba were no longer seaworthy. He had them stripped of their sails, rigging, and iron, and then he had them scuttled. He burned his boats, there was no going back. Before his men stood an empire, behind them the sea. Their only path to survival, to glory, to wealth was forward. It was a staggering gamble, the act of a madman or a genius. In Cortés's case, he was probably both. His men, now bound to his fate, had a simple choice: conquer or die. The conquest would have been impossible, a suicidal fantasy without one crucial element, one person who would bridge the chasm between two utterly alien worlds. Her name was Malintzin, baptized as Doña Marina, but known to history as La Malinche. She was a Nahua noblewoman who had been sold into slavery as a child and ended up in the hands of a Mayan lord in Tabasco. When the Spanish defeated the Tabascans in an early skirmish, she was given to them as a tribute, one of 20 slave women. It was soon discovered that she spoke not only Mayan but also Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. The Spanish had a priest, Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked years earlier and spoke Mayan. A chain of translation was forged. Cortés would speak Spanish to Aguilar, Aguilar would speak Mayan to Malinche, and Malinche would speak Nahuatl to the Aztecs. She was more than a translator, she was a cultural interpreter. She understood the nuances of Aztec politics, the factions at court, the simmering resentments of the subject peoples. She became Cortés's strategist, his diplomat, his mistress, and the mother of his son, one of the first mestizos. To the Spanish, she was a gift from God. To many in modern Mexico, her name is synonymous with betrayal. But was she a traitor? Or was she a survivor? A woman who seized the only agency available to her in a world where she had been stripped of everything, choosing the winning side in a conflict she had not started. Could you betray your people to save yourself from an even greater evil? Her voice would become the key that unlocked the Aztec Empire, whispering its secrets, its fears, and its weaknesses into the ear of the man who had come to destroy it. The Spanish presence was a paradox the Aztecs could not solve. Their power was undeniable. In the first real battle at Tabasco, the sight of the cavalry charge was enough to shatter the morale of thousands of native warriors. The natives fought with obsidian-edged wooden swords, the macuacuitl, a fearsome weapon capable of decapitating a man, but it shattered against Spanish steel armor. Their cotton armor was no defense against a crossbow bolt or a musket ball, and the cannons, spewing fire and death, seemed like the wrath of the gods themselves. Yet these powerful beings were so few. They bled, they died, they were clearly mortal. Moctezuma's policy was one of appeasement and delay. He sent more gifts, he sent warnings, he forbade the strangers from approaching his capital, Tenochtitlan. But every gift of gold only inflamed the Spaniards' greed, and every warning was interpreted by Cortés as a bluff. Cortés understood something fundamental that Moctezuma did not. You cannot negotiate with an avalanche. You either get out of its way, or you are buried. The emperor, bound by prophecy and protocol, dithered. Cortés, bound by nothing but his own ambition, acted. He began his march inland, a tiny band of adventurers intent on confronting a god-king in the heart of his seemingly invincible empire, a march into the very heart of darkness. This march was a testament to Cortés's audacity and his keen political mind. He quickly realized that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic entity, but a fragile construct held together by fear. As he moved inland, he encountered tribe after tribe that chafed under Aztec rule, forced to pay a heavy tribute in goods and human lives. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. This was a lie, of course, but it was a powerful and effective one. His first major test came when he entered the territory of the Tlaxcalans. The Tlaxcalans were a proud and warlike people, one of the few nations in central Mexico that had successfully resisted Aztec domination. They were the traditional enemy, the suppliers of captives for the Flower Wars. They saw the Spanish not as gods, but as dangerous invaders. For 2 weeks, they threw their massive armies against Cortés's small force in a series of ferocious battles. The Spanish were pushed to the brink of annihilation. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier in the expedition, whose chronicle provides an astonishingly vivid account of the conquest, wrote of nights spent treating wounds with the fat rendered from dead Indian soldiers, of constant terror and exhaustion. Yet Spanish steel, cavalry, and superior tactics prevailed against overwhelming numbers. After suffering staggering losses, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a calculated decision. They could not defeat these strangers, but perhaps with them as allies, they could finally defeat their ancient enemy, the Aztecs. It was a pact with the devil, but a pact they were willing to make. The Tlaxcalans would provide Cortés with tens of thousands of warriors, becoming his indispensable allies and forever changing the balance of power. The road to Tenochtitlan was now open, paved with the promise of shared vengeance. What drives men to ally with a monster to fight a tyrant? For the Tlaxcalans, the choice was simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. They had endured generations of Aztec aggression, their young men sacrificed on the altars of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish, for all their strangeness and violence, offered a chance to end this cycle of humiliation and death. They did not see the long game. They could not imagine that in helping to destroy the Aztecs, they were sealing their own eventual subjugation. They saw only the immediate prize, the destruction of their hated rival. Cortés, the master manipulator, nurtured this hatred. He promised them riches, revenge, and freedom from Aztec tribute. He now commanded not just 500 Spaniards, but a vast indigenous army fueled by a burning desire for retribution. His next move would be a masterstroke of psychological warfare, an act of calculated terror designed to send a clear and unmistakable message to Moctezuma. He marched his new coalition to the city of Cholula, a sacred center loyal to the Aztecs. The Cholulans welcomed the Spanish into their city, seemingly offering friendship, but Malinche, ever watchful, uncovered a plot. The Cholulans, on orders from Moctezuma, were planning to ambush and massacre the Spanish in the narrow streets of their city. Cortés decided to strike first. The Cholula massacre was not a battle, it was a preemptive slaughter. At a prearranged signal, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies fell upon the unarmed Cholulan nobility who had gathered in a central courtyard. The slaughter was systematic and ruthless. For 2 days, the city was sacked. Temples were burned, thousands were killed. The Tlaxcalans, unleashed upon their traditional rivals, exacted a bloody revenge. The message sent to the rest of the empire, and especially to Moctezuma, was terrifyingly clear. These strangers were not just powerful warriors, they were utterly merciless. They would not play by the established rules of Mesoamerican warfare. They would kill civilians, they would sack holy cities, they would do the unthinkable. The psychological impact was devastating. Moctezuma, who had been orchestrating resistance from afar, was now gripped by a paralyzing fear. His plots had been discovered, his power to command obedience through intimidation challenged. He had tried magic, he had tried diplomacy, he had tried assassination. Nothing worked. These men seemed to move outside the bounds of fate that governed his world. The trail of blood from Cholula led directly to the gates of Tenochtitlan, and Moctezuma, his will broken, finally sent word to the invaders. He would welcome them into his capital. He was inviting the fox into the henhouse, but he no longer believed he had a choice. Perhaps, he reasoned, he could control them better from within the city. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of desperation and a profound misunderstanding of his enemy. The march had transformed Cortés's expedition. It was no longer a small band of adventurers. It was the spearhead of a massive indigenous rebellion that he himself had incited. He had exposed the deep fractures within the Aztec Empire and was now exploiting them with surgical precision. Every step towards the capital was fraught with danger. The landscape itself was alien and intimidating. Towering volcanoes, dense forests, deep ravines perfect for an ambush. The soldiers were exhausted, many were wounded, and the fear of the unknown was a constant companion. They were marching into the heart of an empire that could swallow them whole. Yet, they were driven by a powerful cocktail of motivations. Greed was paramount, the dream of gold, of vast estates, of becoming lords in this new land. Religious fervor was another potent force. They saw themselves as crusaders, soldiers of Christ, doing God's work by toppling a heathen empire that practiced human sacrifice. And there was simple survival. Having burned their ships, their only hope was to succeed. Retreat was not an option. This potent combination of greed, God, and desperation made them an incredibly dangerous and determined force. They were men who had nothing to lose and a world to gain. As they descended from the high mountain pass between the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, they saw it for the first time. The Valley of Mexico spread out below them, a sight of such breathtaking beauty that it seemed like a dream. In the center lay a vast system of interconnected lakes, shimmering like a sheet of silver. And in the middle of the largest lake, rising from the water as if by magic, was Tenochtitlan. Connected to the mainland by 3 long, straight causeways, it was a city of impossible grandeur. The soldiers, hardened veterans of European wars, were stunned into silence. Bernal Diaz wrote that they wondered if what they were seeing was not some enchantment from a book of chivalry. It seemed too beautiful, too perfect to be real. This was the prize. This was the golden city of their dreams. But it was also a trap. A city on a lake, accessible only by narrow causeways that could be easily cut, was the perfect defensive position. Once inside, they would be at the mercy of their hosts. Cortés knew the risk, his men knew the risk, but the lure of the city, the promise of the unimaginable wealth it held, was too strong to resist. They marched down into the valley, towards the causeway, towards a meeting with a hesitant emperor and an uncertain fate. The clash of worlds was about to move from the battlefield to the very heart of the Aztec Empire. On the 8th of November 1519, Hernán Cortés and his small army of conquistadors, accompanied by thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies, walked across the great causeway leading into Tenochtitlan. It was a moment of supreme tension and surreal spectacle. The causeway was wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast, and it was crowded with thousands of curious onlookers who had come out in their canoes to gaze upon the strange invaders. The Spanish soldiers, for their part, were gripped by a mixture of awe and terror. They were marching into the center of a city of hundreds of thousands of potential enemies, a city from which there was no easy escape. At the entrance to the city, they were met by a procession of Aztec lords in magnificent feathered regalia. And then they saw him. Moctezuma II was carried forth on a lavish litter, adorned with green quetzal feathers and shielded from the sun by a canopy of green plumage decorated with gold and silver. As he descended, lords laid cloaks upon the ground so that his golden sandals would not touch the earth. He was about 40 years old, slender, with a dignified and melancholy air. This was the meeting of 2 worlds embodied in 2 men: Cortés, the pragmatic and ruthless adventurer; Moctezuma, the fatalistic priest-king, ruler of a universe he believed was coming to an end. Cortés, ever the actor, dismounted and attempted to embrace the emperor, a common greeting among Europeans. The Aztec lords, horrified at this breach of protocol, for no one was allowed to touch the Tlatoani, held him back. Instead, the two leaders exchanged necklaces. Cortés offered one of strung glass beads. Moctezuma presented one of red shells from which hung 8 golden shrimp of exquisite craftsmanship. Through the translation chain of Aguilar and Malinche, they exchanged formal greetings. Moctezuma's words, as recorded by Spanish chroniclers, are haunting in their fatalism. He welcomed Cortés as the returning Quetzalcoatl, stating that he had long known the god would come from the east to reclaim his throne. "We have been holding it for you," he allegedly said. "Now you have arrived. You have journeyed with great fatigue. Rest now." Was this a genuine belief, a strategic ploy, or something the Spanish later invented to legitimize their conquest? The truth is, likely a complex mixture of all three. Moctezuma, trapped by prophecy and indecision, chose the path of appeasement. He housed the Spaniards in the palace of his father, Axayacatl, a vast complex in the heart of the city's ceremonial precinct, right next to the Templo Mayor. He treated them as honored guests, showering them with gifts, food, and servants. The conquistadors had walked into the lion's den, and the lion had welcomed them with open paws. They were living in a golden cage. The Spanish were astounded by what they found. The city was a marvel. They wandered through the vast marketplace, amazed at the order and the sheer variety of goods from every corner of the empire. They visited the aviaries and the zoo, filled with creatures they had never seen. But they also saw the temples, their walls caked with dried blood, and the priests with their long, matted hair, reeking of death. They saw the skull racks and witnessed the rites of human sacrifice. It was a civilization of profound contradictions, of sublime beauty and terrifying brutality. For Cortés, this was both a confirmation of his divine mission to stamp out this devil worship and a constant, terrifying reminder of the fate that awaited them if their position weakened. They were a handful of men surrounded by a sea of warriors who could annihilate them at any moment. The initial hospitality was wearing thin and the tension was palpable. The Aztec nobles and priests were growing resentful of the strangers' presence and their emperor's passivity. They could not understand why Moctezuma tolerated these uncouth, demanding foreigners who showed no respect for their gods or traditions. How long before this simmering resentment boiled over into open rebellion? Cortés knew his position was untenable. Being a guest was a weakness. He needed to change the dynamic, to seize control. He needed to turn his golden cage into a fortress and his host into a hostage. The pretext came soon enough. A Spanish garrison that Cortés had left on the coast was attacked by an Aztec tributary lord, and several Spaniards were killed. This was the excuse Cortés needed. With a small group of his most trusted captains, he went to Moctezuma's palace. In a move of breathtaking audacity, he accused the emperor of ordering the attack and demanded that he come with them to the Spanish quarters to prove his loyalty. It was, in effect, a polite kidnapping. Moctezuma was stunned, then enraged, then terrified. He protested his innocence, he argued, he pleaded, but the Spanish were adamant. One of Cortés's captains, a hothead named Juan Velázquez de León, lost his patience and drew his sword, shouting that they should either take him or kill him on the spot. Faced with this direct threat, Moctezuma's will crumbled. To maintain the fiction that he was still in command, he agreed to go with them, telling his own people that he was doing so of his own free will, on the advice of his gods. It was a lie that fooled no one. The emperor of the mighty Aztec Empire had become a prisoner in his own capital, a puppet ruler whose strings were now pulled by a few hundred foreign adventurers. The slow, quiet strangulation of an empire had begun. What would you do if you were a king and an armed guest in your house declared he was now in charge? Do you risk war and certain destruction, or do you submit, hoping to save your people and your own life? Tell us what choice you would have made. Do you fight for honor or submit for survival? Let the world know your answer in the comments. From his gilded prison, Moctezuma continued to rule in name, but his authority was a shadow. Cortés was now the de facto ruler of the empire. He forced Moctezuma to swear allegiance to the King of Spain, Charles V. He demanded that the imperial storerooms be opened, and the Spanish were staggered by the treasure they contained. An entire room was filled with gold dust, bars, and intricate jewelry. Priceless works of art, the product of generations of master craftsmen, were appraised only for their weight in gold and ordered to be melted down into crude bars for easier division. The Spanish soldiers, many of them common men from humble backgrounds, were suddenly faced with a level of wealth they could not have imagined in their wildest dreams. But this wealth was also a poison. It bred jealousy and mistrust among them, and it did not quench their thirst, it only made it more ferocious. Cortés also pushed his religious agenda. He had an altar with a cross and an image of the Virgin Mary erected atop the Templo Mayor, right next to the blood-soaked idols of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. To the Aztecs, this was the ultimate sacrilege, a defilement of their most sacred space. The priests were in an uproar, and the populace was seething with a quiet rage that grew more intense with each passing day. The psychological duel between Cortés and Moctezuma is one of history's great dramas. Cortés was a master of manipulation, constantly testing the emperor's limits, alternating between charm and threats. Moctezuma, for his part, seems to have developed a strange, complex relationship with his captor, a kind of Stockholm syndrome. He taught Cortés the games they played, showed him the city, and seemed resigned to his fate, convinced that the Spaniards' arrival was the fulfillment of an unalterable destiny. But beneath this veneer of compliance, the emperor was not entirely broken. He secretly sent messages to his nephew Cuitlahuac, a fierce warrior who advocated for the extermination of the invaders, urging patience, but perhaps also tacitly encouraging resistance. The Aztec nobility was plotting. The situation was a powder keg, and the fuse was about to be lit by an unexpected arrival from the coast. A new Spanish force had landed, much larger than Cortés's own, sent by the governor of Cuba, Pánfilo de Narváez, with orders to arrest Cortés for treason and insubordination. Cortés was now trapped between two enemies, a resentful Aztec population in front of him and a rival Spanish army behind him. His audacious gamble was on the verge of collapsing. Leaving a garrison of about 120 men in Tenochtitlan under the command of his most volatile and ruthless captain, Pedro de Alvarado, Cortés took the rest of his force and marched to the coast to confront Narváez. In a brilliant and daring night attack during a torrential downpour, Cortés's smaller, more experienced force defeated Narváez's army and, through a combination of bribes and promises of immense wealth, persuaded most of his rivals' soldiers to join him. It was another stunning victory, a testament to his charisma and tactical genius. He now commanded a much larger Spanish army. But while he was away, disaster struck in Tenochtitlan. Alvarado, known to the Aztecs as Tonatiuh, the sun god because of his blonde hair, was a man who lacked Cortés's subtlety and political acumen. He was paranoid, greedy, and prone to extreme violence. Hearing rumors of a planned uprising, he decided to launch his own preemptive strike, a move that would dwarf the Cholula massacre in its folly and brutality. The opportunity came during the festival of Toxcatl, a major religious ceremony to honor Huitzilopochtli. The flower of the Aztec nobility, thousands of unarmed warriors and priests, were gathered in the main ceremonial courtyard, dancing and chanting. At the height of the ceremony, Alvarado ordered the exit sealed, and his soldiers, along with their Tlaxcalan allies, fell upon the defenseless crowd. The massacre at the Templo Mayor was an act of unmitigated butchery. Unarmed men were cut down where they danced. The courtyard ran with blood. It was a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. Where the Cholula massacre had been a calculated act of terror to intimidate a distant enemy, this was the slaughter of the ruling class of a city where the Spanish were already trapped. The quiet resentment of the Aztecs exploded into a city-wide firestorm of pure rage. The Spanish garrison, including the terrified Alvarado, was besieged in their palace. The sound of the war drums, the huehuetl, boomed across the city day and night, a chilling, relentless rhythm calling the entire population to arms. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan, flushed with his victory over Narvaez, he walked not into a city he controlled, but into a death trap. The streets were eerily silent. The bridges on the causeways had been raised. He managed to reach the palace and rejoin his besieged men, but now his entire, much larger army was trapped along with them. The Aztecs, now led by the formidable Cuitlahuac, launched a series of ferocious, unrelenting attacks on the Spanish compound. The air was thick with arrows, stones, and spears. The guests were now prisoners, surrounded by a furious city baying for their blood. In a desperate attempt to quell the uprising, Cortés forced the disgraced Moctezuma to go to the rooftop of the palace and speak to his people, to order them to lay down their arms. The emperor, a broken man, obeyed, but his authority was gone. His people no longer saw him as their revered Tlatoani, but as a coward and a traitor, a mouthpiece for their hated enemies. The response from the crowd was not obedience, but a shower of stones and insults. One of those stones struck the emperor in the head. A few days later, Moctezuma died. The Spanish claimed he died from his wounds, refusing food and medical aid. The Aztec sources claim the Spanish murdered him once he was no longer useful to them. Whatever the truth, his death removed the last buffer between the Spanish and the fury of the Aztec warriors. The situation was hopeless. Food and water were running out, gunpowder was low, and every day the attacks grew more intense. Cortés realized that their only hope for survival was to break out of the city, to flee under the cover of darkness. The night chosen for the escape was June 30th, 1520. It would go down in Spanish history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The plan was desperate and fraught with peril. They would try to escape along the western causeway, the shortest of the three. To cross the gaps where the Aztecs had removed the bridges, the Spanish built a portable wooden bridge. The breakout began late at night under the cover of a thick drizzle. To muffle the sound of the horses' hooves, they wrapped them in cloth. They moved in silence, a long, tense column of soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies, burdened by cannons, crossbows, and something far heavier, gold. Cortés had ordered his men to take only what they could carry, but many, crazed with greed, stuffed their pockets and armor with the melted gold bars from Moctezuma's treasury. They were about to learn a terrible lesson. In a desperate fight for survival, gold is not a treasure, but an anchor. Their escape was soon discovered. A woman fetching water saw them and raised the alarm. The great war drum on the Templo Mayor began to boom its terrifying rhythm across the lake. Suddenly, the darkness erupted in a cacophony of war cries. From the canals on either side of the causeway, thousands of Aztec warriors in canoes swarmed them. From the rooftops of the city, a hail of projectiles rained down. The orderly retreat disintegrated into a panicked, chaotic rout. The narrow causeway became a slaughterhouse. The portable bridge became stuck in the first gap and was useless. The column broke apart. The gaps in the causeway became chasms of death. Soldiers, weighed down by armor and gold, were pushed or fell into the water, where they were either clubbed to death by warriors in canoes or simply drowned, pulled to the bottom by the very treasure they had refused to leave behind. The canal at the second gap, later named the Toltec Canal, became so choked with the bodies of men and horses that the rearguard, including Cortés himself, was able to scramble across the grisly, makeshift bridge of their own dead comrades. The fighting was hand-to-hand, brutal and desperate in the darkness, illuminated only by torches and the flash of steel. The Tlaxcalan allies, caught in the middle of the column, suffered horrific casualties. The Spanish rearguard, commanded by the now hated Pedro de Alvarado, was cut to pieces. Legend has it that Alvarado himself escaped by making a phenomenal leap over one of the gaps with his lance, an act that gave the spot the name Alvarado's Leap. It was a complete and utter catastrophe. By the time the shattered remnants of Cortés's army reached the mainland at dawn, the scale of the disaster was apparent. At least half of his Spanish soldiers, perhaps 600 men or more, were dead. Thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies had been slaughtered. All the cannons, all the gunpowder, and almost all the gold were at the bottom of Lake Texcoco. Cortés, a man not known for showing emotion, is said to have sat beneath a great ahuehuete tree and wept. His grand enterprise was in ruins. He had been utterly defeated, his army destroyed, his aura of invincibility shattered. The conquest was over, or so it seemed. But the Aztecs did not press their advantage. They had won a great victory and were focused on the rituals of sacrifice for the captured Spaniards, whose pale, naked bodies were taken to the top of the Templo Mayor. The surviving conquistadors, watching from the shore, could hear the screams of their comrades as their hearts were torn out. It was a horrifying spectacle that would fuel their desire for a terrible revenge. For now they were in a desperate flight for their lives, harried at every step by Aztec forces. Wounded, starving and demoralized, they retreated towards the safety of Tlaxcala, their only remaining hope. A week after the Noche Triste, near the town of Otumba, a massive Aztec army, numbering in the tens of thousands, finally cornered the few hundred surviving Spaniards and their remaining Tlaxcalan allies on an open plain. This was to be the final annihilation. What followed was one of the most remarkable and desperate battles in military history. The Spanish were completely surrounded, on the verge of being overrun by sheer numbers. But in the chaos, Cortés spotted the Aztec commander, magnificently attired in feathers and bearing the army's standard. In a final suicidal gamble, Cortés, with a few of his best horsemen, charged directly through the enemy ranks, straight for the commander. They broke through, Cortés struck the leader down, and another captain seized the standard. The effect on the Aztec army was instantaneous and catastrophic. Seeing their commander fall and their standard captured, which signified a complete defeat, their morale shattered. The vast army dissolved, the warriors simply turned and fled. Against all odds, the Spanish had survived. They limped back to Tlaxcala, a battered, broken remnant, but they were not defeated. In the heart of Hernán Cortés, the tears of the Noche Triste had hardened into an unbreakable resolve. He would be back. He would not just conquer Tenochtitlan, he would erase it from the face of the earth. The fires of vengeance burn hotter than any other flame. For Cortés, the humiliation of the Noche Triste was not an end, but a new beginning. He and his men had seen the reality of Aztec power and the fate that awaited them in defeat. There could be no peace, no negotiation. It was now a war of total annihilation. His survival and the loyalty of his Tlaxcalan allies were miracles in themselves. The Tlaxcalans, despite their own staggering losses, saw in Cortés's survival a sign of his unique power. They debated executing the Spaniards and making peace with the Aztecs, but their hatred for their old enemies and the charisma of Cortés won out. They recommitted to the alliance, providing a safe haven for the Spanish to recover and, more importantly, tens of thousands of fresh warriors for the campaign to come. Cortés began to meticulously plan his revenge. He knew a direct assault on the causeways was suicide. He needed to control the lake that was Tenochtitlan's greatest defense. He needed a fleet. And so, in an astonishing feat of logistics and engineering, he ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, small but fast sailing vessels armed with cannons. The ships were built in pieces in Tlaxcala, using the iron and rigging salvaged from the ships he had scuttled nearly 2 years before. Then, thousands of native porters carried the pieces over the mountains to be assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. It was a mad, brilliant plan to build a European war fleet in the heart of Mesoamerica to lay siege to a city on a lake. While Cortés was building his fleet and gathering a new, even larger army of indigenous allies from every city-state that hated the Aztecs, a new and far more terrible weapon was unleashed upon Tenochtitlan, an invisible ally for the Spanish. An African slave in the army of Narvaez had been carrying smallpox. The disease, unknown in the Americas, spread like wildfire through the dense population of the Valley of Mexico. The native people had no immunity. The results were apocalyptic. The disease killed by the tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands. It swept through Tenochtitlan, leaving streets piled with the dead. One of its victims was the hero of the Noche Triste, the new emperor, Cuitlahuac. The Aztec leadership was thrown into disarray, the population was decimated, their morale shattered by a plague they could not understand, a horror that seemed to target them while leaving the Spaniards largely untouched. To the natives, it was as if the gods themselves had abandoned them. The Aztecs built their empire on ritual violence, but they were now facing a biological warfare they could not even comprehend. The siege of Tenochtitlan would not just be a battle of men, it would be a war against a pestilence that rotted the empire from within before the final assault even began. By the time Cortés was ready to launch his attack in the spring of 1521, he was not merely besieging a city, he was closing in on a graveyard. The new emperor of the Aztecs was a young man, a nephew of Moctezuma named Cuauhtémoc, which means falling eagle. He was a fierce and determined warrior who refused any thought of surrender. He would lead the desperate, heroic, and doomed defense of his dying city. By May, Cortés was ready. His plan was methodical and brutal. He had over 90,000 indigenous allies and about 900 Spaniards, now re-equipped with crossbows, muskets, and cannons from newly arrived ships. He divided his forces into 3 divisions, each tasked with attacking one of the main causeways. The newly launched brigantines, a fleet of wooden leviathans on this inland lake, quickly proved their worth. They shattered the Aztec war canoe fleets, giving the Spanish control of the water. This allowed them to blockade the city, cutting off all supplies of food and fresh water. The siege had begun. The fighting was ferocious, a grinding war of attrition for every inch of the causeways. The Aztecs fought with desperate courage, pulling up the bridges, setting traps, and launching canoe-borne raids on the Spanish flanks. The Spanish would advance during the day, and at night, the Aztecs would reclaim the ground they had lost. Cortés realized that this stalemate was too costly. He changed tactics. The advance would be slower but permanent. As his forces gained ground on the causeways and pushed into the city itself, they would systematically demolish every building behind them. Every house, every temple, every palace was to be torn down and used to fill in the canals. They would not just capture Tenochtitlan, they would unmake it, transforming the waterborne city into a flat, dry plain over which their cavalry could operate. The beautiful city that had so stunned them upon their arrival was now being methodically destroyed by their own hands. The fighting moved from the causeways into the streets of the city. It was a brutal house-to-house urban warfare. The brigantines would provide covering fire from the canals, while the ground troops advanced, tearing down barricades and battling for every rooftop. The Aztec warriors, though starving and weakened by disease, fought for their homes with a ferocity that stunned the Spanish. They would not surrender. They would fight until the last man for the last stone of their city. The siege turned into a vision of hell. The stench of death hung over the Valley of Mexico. The canals were choked with corpses. For the defenders trapped inside the city, it was an apocalypse. Famine, thirst, and disease were killing more people than the Spanish weapons. They were reduced to eating leather, tree bark, and worms. Yet, under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, they fought on. The eagle was falling, but it would not go gently into the darkness. The final weeks of the siege were a relentless, grinding agony. The Spanish and their allies pushed the remaining defenders into a smaller and smaller section of the city, the Tlatelolco district. The fighting was constant, the slaughter immense. Bernal Diaz wrote that the ground was so littered with the dead and dying that they could not walk without stepping on bodies. Cortés repeatedly sent offers of peace to Cuauhtémoc, promising to spare his life and honor him if he would only surrender. But Cuauhtémoc, knowing the fate of his uncle Moctezuma and the character of his enemies, refused every time. He knew that surrender would only lead to enslavement for his people and a dishonorable death for himself. He chose to fight to the end, to preside over the noble death of his civilization rather than its shameful subjugation. He embodied the unbending spirit of a people facing annihilation. His courage became a legend, a symbol of resistance against impossible odds. What defines a hero more? A pragmatic victory won through compromise, or a noble defeat in a fight for one's beliefs? It is a question that haunts the memory of this brutal conflict. The agony of Tenochtitlan was the birth pang of a new world, a world built upon the ruins of the old. The final assault came on August 13th, 1521. After 93 days of relentless siege, the last pocket of Aztec resistance collapsed. The fighting devolved into a chaotic massacre as the Tlaxcalans and other allies, finally unleashed upon their hated enemies, took a terrible revenge, slaughtering men, women, and children. In the midst of the chaos, Cuauhtémoc tried to escape across the lake in a large canoe with his family and his chief warriors. He was spotted by one of the Spanish brigantines, commanded by Garcia Holguin. The brigantine quickly ran the canoe down. As the Spanish soldiers prepared to fire their crossbows, Cuauhtémoc stood and declared, "I am Cuauhtémoc. Take me to Malinche and Cortés. Do not harm my wife or my followers." The capture of the last emperor marked the end. The resistance, which had been centered around his charismatic leadership, ceased. The great city of Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, had fallen. The silence that descended upon the ruins was the silence of a dead world. The conquest was complete. The eagle had fallen. The immediate aftermath was not a celebration of a glorious victory, but a grim and sordid affair of looting and destruction. The stench of death from tens of thousands of unburied corpses was so overwhelming that Cortés and his men had to withdraw from the city for several days. When they returned, the real work of the victors began. And that work was the search for gold. The Spanish soldiers, who had dreamed of unimaginable riches, were bitterly disappointed. The systematic looting of the ruins yielded far less treasure than they had expected. Most of the gold, they reasoned, must have been hidden by the Aztecs before or during the siege. The soldiers grew mutinous, accusing Cortés of hiding the treasure for himself and the Spanish crown. They demanded that Cuauhtémoc and the other captured Aztec lords be forced to reveal where the gold was hidden. Cortés, under pressure from his men, consented to one of the most shameful episodes of the entire conquest. He had Cuauhtémoc tortured. The last emperor of the Aztecs, along with the lord of the neighboring city of Tacuba, had his feet put to the fire, slowly roasted over hot coals. Yet Cuauhtémoc refused to speak, enduring the agony with a stoicism that amazed his tormentors. According to legend, when the lord of Tacuba screamed in pain, Cuauhtémoc rebuked him, asking, "Do you think I am in some kind of bath or delight?" He revealed nothing, perhaps because there was nothing left to reveal. The great treasure was gone, lost to the lake during the Noche Triste, or simply never as vast as the conquistadors' fevered imaginations had believed. The victory felt hollow, the prize elusive. Imagine you are one of Cortés's soldiers. You've survived plague, battles, and starvation, all for the promise of gold. Now it's gone. Who do you blame? Your enemy for hiding it, or your leader for failing to find it? Your choice reveals a lot. Tell us in the comments. The failure to find a massive hoard of gold did not stop the destruction. In fact, it may have accelerated it. In their frustration, the Spanish unleashed a wave of cultural vandalism. What little treasure they did find, exquisite jewelry, intricate masks, religious artifacts, was not valued for its artistry. It was seen only as bullion. Masterpieces of Aztec goldsmithing were melted down into crude, standardized bars stamped with the seal of the Spanish crown. It was the destruction of a library, the burning of an art museum. An entire civilization's artistic heritage was fed into the crucible of European greed. The temples and pyramids, their idols already smashed, were systematically dismantled, their stones used as the foundations for a new city. On the ruins of the great ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan, a new capital, Mexico City, would rise. A Catholic cathedral would be built directly on the site of the Templo Mayor, its foundation stones the very ones that had once been stained with the blood of sacrifices. It was a powerful and deliberate statement. One world was being buried, another was being built on its grave. The physical city was destroyed, but the memory, the idea of what was lost, would haunt the conquerors. The thirst for gold, still unquenched, would mutate into a new, more powerful myth. Disappointed in Mexico, the conquistadors began to look further afield, listening to rumors of other, even richer empires waiting to be found. They heard tales of a king who covered himself in gold dust, of a city made entirely of gold. The legend of El Dorado was born from the ashes of Tenochtitlan, a phantom of greed that would drive Spanish explorers on new, desperate and bloody expeditions into the jungles and mountains of South America for decades to come. The conquest of the Aztecs did not satisfy their hunger, it only made it infinite. The life of Cuauhtémoc, the captured emperor, ended a few years later. Cortés, fearing he might become a symbol for rebellion, took him along on a grueling expedition to Honduras. Somewhere in the jungles, on the pretext of an alleged conspiracy, Cortés had him hanged from a saber tree. The death of the falling eagle was ignominious, a final, quiet act of political expediency. The man who had bravely defended his city to the last was disposed of like a common criminal, far from the land he had ruled. The era of the conquistadors was also drawing to a close. Many of them, including Cortés himself, found that the fruits of their victory were bitter. Cortés was showered with titles and land by the Spanish crown, but was slowly stripped of real political power by the arrival of royal bureaucrats and lawyers sent to govern the new territory, now called New Spain. He spent years embroiled in lawsuits, fighting rivals, and defending his actions. He returned to Spain a wealthy but frustrated man, a figure from a bygone era of heroic, brutal adventure, ill-suited for the world of courtly intrigue. He died in near obscurity in Spain in 1547, his final requests to be buried in the land he had conquered initially ignored. The men who had risked everything to win an empire found themselves masters of a world they had destroyed but could not truly possess. The conquest had devoured the Aztecs, and in the end, it devoured its own creators as well. The dream of gold had built an empire and then destroyed it. The real wealth of Mexico, however, was not the easily plunderable gold of the Aztec treasury, but the vast silver mines that would be discovered in the coming decades. These mines, worked by a system of forced native labor, would unleash a torrent of silver upon the world. This silver would fuel the Spanish Empire for over a century, financing its European wars, building its grand palaces and churches, and fundamentally altering the global economy. The flow of precious metals from the New World helped to trigger a period of massive inflation in Europe, known as the Price Revolution. It shifted economic power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The conquest of Mexico was not just a local event, it was a catalyst for the birth of a truly globalized world, a world connected by new shipping routes, new commodities, and new forms of exploitation. The clash of worlds in the Valley of Mexico had sent ripples across the entire planet, changing the course of history for everyone, not just the vanquished. The price of gold was far higher than anyone could have imagined, paid not just in blood, but in the reshaping of the entire globe. With the military conquest complete, a new and perhaps more insidious conquest began, the conquest of the soul. The soldiers with their swords were followed by priests with their crosses. Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars arrived with a mission to eradicate the indigenous religion and replace it with Christianity. For them, the Aztec gods were not just false idols, they were demons. The Aztec religion, with its public rituals of human sacrifice, was seen as the literal work of Satan. This belief justified a campaign of total cultural destruction. Thousands of native codices, the painted books that contained the history, science, and religious knowledge of the Aztec and other Mesoamerican peoples, were gathered and burned in massive bonfires. It was an act of cultural genocide, an attempt to erase the memory of an entire civilization. Temples were razed and idols were smashed. The spiritual world of the native peoples was turned upside down. Their sacred places were desecrated, their priests were killed or disgraced, and the cosmic order that had given their lives meaning was declared a demonic lie. It was a spiritual violence that cut deeper than any sword. In place of the old gods, a new one was offered. Mass baptisms were held, with thousands of natives converted to Christianity in a single day. Churches were built everywhere, often using the stones of the destroyed pyramids, a constant physical reminder of the new order. The people of Mexico were brought into the fold of the Catholic Church, but how deep did this conversion truly go? On the surface, the old ways were abandoned, but underneath, they survived. The old gods did not simply die, they went into hiding. They merged with the new faith in a process called syncretism. A native deity associated with the earth and fertility might become identified with the Virgin Mary. A local Saints' Day festival might incorporate ancient pre-Christian rituals and dances. It was a form of spiritual resistance. Unable to defeat the new religion, the people absorbed it, reshaping it to fit their own worldview, preserving the essence of their ancient beliefs under a thin Christian veneer. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared to an indigenous man, Juan Diego, on a hill that was a sacred site for the Aztec mother goddess Tonantzin, is perhaps the most powerful symbol of this new, uniquely Mexican faith, a synthesis of two worlds born from a spiritual battlefield. The economic and social structure of New Spain was built on the exploitation of the indigenous population. The Spanish crown granted conquistadors and settlers encomiendas, which gave them the right to demand tribute and forced labor from a specific group of native communities. In theory, the encomendero was supposed to protect his charges and see to their religious instruction. In practice, the encomienda system was a brutal form of legalized slavery. Native people were forced to work in the mines, on plantations, and on construction projects under horrific conditions. Coupled with the devastating impact of old-world diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which they had no immunity, the native population of central Mexico collapsed. It is estimated that in the century following the conquest, the population declined by as much as 90%. It was one of the most severe demographic catastrophes in human history. The land was emptied, its people broken. The Aztec Empire had demanded a tribute of blood, but the Spanish Empire demanded a tribute of labor that consumed lives on an industrial scale. The new gods may have forbidden human sacrifice, but the new economy required it in a different, more grinding form. Yet, out of this crucible of violence, disease, and exploitation, a new culture and a new people were born. The arrival of the Spanish began a process of biological and cultural mixing. Spanish men took native women as wives and concubines, both through force and through alliance building. Their children, the mestizos, were of mixed heritage, belonging fully to neither the world of their Spanish fathers nor the world of their indigenous mothers. For centuries, they would occupy a complex and often marginalized position in the rigid caste system of colonial Spain. But over time, they would become the demographic and cultural majority, the foundation of modern Mexico. The very identity of Mexico is a product of this violent collision. It is a culture that lives with its ghosts, a place where the pre-Hispanic past is both a source of immense national pride and a wound that has never fully healed. The language is Spanish, the dominant religion is Catholicism, but the food, the art, the music, the very way people see the world is saturated with the echoes of the indigenous civilizations that were conquered but never entirely erased. The Empire of Ghosts left its mark on the soul of the living. The conquest of the Aztecs was a beginning, not an end. It established a pattern for European colonization across the Americas. The strategies Cortés used, exploiting internal divisions, using technological superiority, and waging psychological warfare, would be copied by other conquistadors like Francisco Pizarro in his conquest of the Inca Empire. The conquest also triggered the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, culture, technology, and ideas between the Americas and the Old World. From the Americas, Europe received potatoes, maize, corn, tomatoes, chocolate, and tobacco, foods that would revolutionize its diet and agriculture, fueling a population boom. From Europe, the Americas received wheat, sugarcane, cattle, pigs, and, most consequentially, horses. The horse, which had been extinct in the Americas for millennia, would transform the cultures of many indigenous groups, particularly on the Great Plains of North America. But the exchange was not all positive. The transfer of diseases, primarily from Europe to the Americas, was catastrophic, and the conquest opened the door to the Atlantic slave trade, as the decimation of native populations led Europeans to import millions of Africans to work on the plantations of the New World. The clash of worlds in Mexico set in motion forces that would create the modern, interconnected, and often deeply unequal world we live in today. The figures at the heart of this drama have become eternal archetypes. Hernán Cortés remains a deeply controversial figure. Was he a heroic explorer, a brilliant military strategist who brought Christianity and civilization to a savage land? Or was he a greedy, ruthless war criminal, a destroyer of worlds driven by avarice and fanaticism? The answer often depends on who you ask and where they stand. In Spain, streets are named after him. In Mexico, there are virtually no public monuments to him. His name is synonymous with a painful and violent birth. Moctezuma, too, is a complex and tragic figure. Was he a weak and indecisive ruler, paralyzed by superstition, who gave away his empire? Or was he a pragmatic leader caught in an impossible situation, trying to save his people from a form of warfare and a worldview so alien he could not comprehend it? His legacy is one of defeat, but also of a profound and tragic dignity. The story of the conquest is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a story with no clear heroes, a tragedy written in shades of grey, of blood and of gold. Today, the echoes of that clash still reverberate. The legacy of the conquest is debated in classrooms, in political arenas, and on the streets. Protests over colonial-era statues, demands for reparations, and struggles for indigenous rights are all part of the ongoing effort to come to terms with this violent history. The conquest poses fundamental questions that we still grapple with today. What happens when two radically different realities collide? Who has the right to claim ownership of land, of resources, of souls? What is the true meaning of progress and civilization? Is it right to impose one's own vision of the world on others by force? The story of the Aztecs and the conquistadors is a powerful, cautionary tale. It shows how misunderstanding, fueled by greed, and a sense of absolute certainty in one's own righteousness can lead to catastrophe. It reminds us that beneath the veneer of civilization, on all sides, lies a capacity for both incredible creativity and unspeakable brutality. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just the end of an empire, it was a lesson written in fire and stone about the fragility of worlds and the enduring consequences of their collision. The history of this conquest forces us to confront an uncomfortable choice, one that is not confined to the past. It's a choice about the very nature of human society. On one side, we have the Aztec world, a society of incredible artistic, scientific, and architectural achievement, but one built upon a foundation of state-sponsored terror and ritual human sacrifice. It represented a rigid, cosmic order where the individual was subordinate to the collective and the survival of the universe demanded a constant tribute of blood. On the other side, we have the conquistadors, bearers of a new technology, a new religion, and a restless, individualistic drive that would eventually reshape the entire globe. They brought with them a brutal, rapacious form of progress, one that shattered the old world to build a new one, justifying enslavement and destruction in the name of God and gold. There are no easy answers here, no blameless victims. So, the final question is not just about history, it's about the world we have inherited. If you were forced to choose a foundation for a new society, which poison would you pick? The bloody certainty of sacred order or the chaotic ambition of relentless progress? Write your choice in the comments. This is more than a historical debate. It's the dilemma that continues to shape our civilization.